On a cold Christmas Eve in Silver Springs, Officer Tim and his loyal German Shepherd, Cola, are on their routine patrol when they uncover a heartbreaking scene. An abandoned child, alone and shivering in the snow. As the boy opens up about his painful past, Cola's unwavering presence becomes his only comfort. With the dog by his side, the boy begins to find solace, but the emotional journey ahead is far from over. How far will Cola's loyalty and protection go in helping this broken boy heal? Watch to discover the heartwarming truth. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if this story touched your heart. The icy wind whipped through the streets of Silver Springs, a small town nestled between snow-covered mountains. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of a porch light. The snow fell softly, blanketing everything in sight, muffling the world into a quiet, lonely silence. The town seemed frozen in time, as if waiting for something to break the stillness. Inside the police cruiser, Tim drove slowly, his eyes scanning the road as his breath fogged up the glass. The heater hummed, but it did little to ward off the cold creeping through the car's thin walls. It was Christmas Eve, but the holiday's warmth felt far away. Tim liked it that way. He had always preferred working the holiday shifts. There was no pressure to participate in family dinners or smile through the endless well-wishes. Being alone on Christmas was easier than facing memories he had long buried. The passing houses looked like something out of a snow globe, their windows glowing softly with families gathered inside, safe and warm. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt that kind of comfort. The cold, however, was familiar. It was something he could control, something that didn't ask him to pretend. Beside him, Cola, his faithful German shepherd, sat alert as always. The dog's golden-brown fur glistened under the dim streetlights, his eyes scanning the road as if searching for something. It had been 3 years since Tim and Cola were paired together, but in that time the bond between them had only grown stronger. Tim trusted Cola's instincts more than his own. The dog had become more than a partner. It was his anchor. The cruiser turned onto Hawthorne Street, a road Tim had driven down countless times before, but tonight felt different. As he made his way toward the edge of town, Cola suddenly stiffened, his body tensing. The dog's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl, an almost imperceptible sound, but one that Tim recognized instantly. "What is it, buddy?" Tim muttered, easing his foot off the gas pedal. He glanced at Cola, whose gaze was fixed ahead, unwavering. Then, without warning, Cola's growl grew louder, a deeper, more urgent warning. Tim slowed the car to a crawl, his hand gripping the wheel tighter. He felt the familiar stir of unease, the kind that always accompanied Cola's reactions. It was a feeling he had learned to trust. Cola tugged at his harness, urging Tim forward. The dog's nose was low to the ground as if tracking something or someone. They approached a dilapidated house on the edge of town, one Tim had always passed by without a second thought. But tonight it stood out. Its windows were boarded up, the paint peeling from the walls, and the front gate sagged on a single hinge. The house had been abandoned for years, but the sight of it now felt unsettling. Tim parked the cruiser in front of the house, the headlights casting long shadows over the yard. The air was thick with snow, falling relentlessly from the dark sky. The silence was broken only by the crunch of their footsteps in the snow as Tim opened the door and stepped out into the cold. Cola was already ahead, his paws pressing into the snow, leading the way. Tim followed, his breath visible in the frigid air. They approached the gate, and Tim felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Something wasn't right. Cola's focus was unwavering, as if he had found what he was looking for. As they rounded the corner of the house, a sound broke through the night, a quiet, broken sobbing. It was the sound of a child, and it sliced through the silence like a knife. Tim's heart skipped a beat. He glanced down at Cola, whose body had gone rigid. Something in the air was changing, and Tim couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something that would change everything. Tim's breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer to the source of the sobbing. Kola had already positioned himself, his body low to the ground, nose almost touching the snow, as if he could sense the child's pain. Tim could barely make out the figure in the distance, hunched against the iron gate, wrapped in what appeared to be a tattered winter jacket far too large for the small body huddled underneath it. The sobs continued, soft and muffled, as if the child were trying not to be heard. Tim's instinct screamed at him to move faster. His boots crunched in the snow as he approached, and the child flinched at the sound but didn't look up. Kola let out a quiet whine, his body stiff but his eyes softening as he moved toward the boy. Tim knelt slowly, keeping his voice steady, though his heart was racing. "Hey there," he said gently. "You're not in trouble." The boy flinched at the sound of his voice, but his eyes lifted just enough to meet Tim's gaze. For a moment there was only silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the child spoke. I didn't mean to be bad," he mumbled, his lips trembling. "I just wanted to see if it would be different here, like it used to be." Tim could see the child now, his face pale from the cold, eyes wide and filled with fear. He looked no older than 10, small for his age, with thin arms wrapped tightly around his knees as if trying to protect himself from the harsh winds. His cheeks were streaked with tears, but some of them had frozen on his face, leaving tiny ice crystals clinging to his skin. Tim's chest tightened as he watched the boy, the stark contrast between his fragile form and the harsh surroundings of the abandoned house making his heart ache. "What's your name, buddy?" Tim asked softly. "Andy?" the boy whispered, his voice barely audible, as though saying it out loud might somehow make it all too real. Tim frowned. "How old are you, Andy?" 10, Andy replied with a faint nod. His voice cracked on the last word, and a sob escaped him, but he quickly stifled it. Tim's eyes softened, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "Why are you out here all alone, Andy?" he asked gently, his voice steady but filled with concern. Andy swallowed hard, wiping his nose with the back of his hand before speaking again. "My parents are gone," he began, his voice trembling. "They died a long time ago. Now I live with my aunt and uncle. They don't like me." He paused, a flicker of fear crossing his face as his eyes darted back to the house behind him. I'm just a mistake." Tim's heart sank at the words. He knew what that kind of feeling felt like. Unwanted, discarded. It struck a painful chord deep within him, a memory he wasn't ready to face. "No, Andy," he said softly, shaking his head. "You're not a mistake, you're not. But you shouldn't be out here, not alone, especially tonight." The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with confusion and something else. "Hope? I thought maybe if I came back here, it wouldn't hurt so much. But it still does. It hurts a lot." Tim felt his own chest tighten as he knelt closer, taking in the situation. The loneliness, the abandonment, the cold. All of it was too familiar. He placed a hand on Andy's shoulder, careful not to startle him. "You don't have to be alone anymore," Tim said quietly, his voice full of conviction. "You're safe now. I'll make sure of it." Kola moved closer, sitting beside Andy, his large frame almost acting like a shield between the boy and the biting cold. Without hesitation, Andy leaned into Kola's warmth, his small hands shaking as they gripped the dog's fur. The comfort the dog provided was immediate, a silent promise of safety and care. Tim watched this connection between the boy and his dog, and for a moment everything else faded away. There was no more bitter cold, no more empty streets, just a boy who had found solace in the warmth of a canine's presence. But this wasn't enough. Andy needed more. He needed safety, protection, love. "Come on, Andy," Tim said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're coming with me. You're not going back there tonight. We're going to get you somewhere warm, somewhere safe." The boy looked up at him, fear flickering in his eyes, but then something shifted. Trust. You promise? Andy asked softly, his voice trembling. I promise, Tim replied, giving him a reassuring smile. Cola let out a soft huff, as if sealing the vow with his presence. Andy nodded once, the briefest of nods, but it was enough. He stood slowly, still shaking, but now with Cola at his side and Tim's hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Tim helped him to his feet, and as they turned toward the cruiser, the weight of the decision settled in. This was only the beginning. There was more to this story than just a boy left out in the cold. As Tim and Andy walked toward the cruiser, the cold wind still biting at their faces, Tim's mind drifted back to a time long ago, a time when he had been the one lost, the one alone. He had only been 7 when he was placed in his first foster home. His memories of that time were blurry, but the feeling of loneliness was sharp and clear. He remembered the coldness of the walls, the silence that filled the empty rooms, and the way the other kids would avoid him, never really understanding what it meant to be the new kid in a house that wasn't really home. He had learned to keep his distance, to make himself invisible, so that no one would notice when he felt alone. Tim had been shuffled from one home to another, never staying in one place long enough to form a bond. There were no loving parents, no warm meals at the table, no laughter echoing through the halls. The few times he tried to reach out, to trust someone, it always ended in disappointment. The adults in his life were too busy, too caught up in their own problems to notice the quiet little boy slipping through the cracks. It was on nights like this one that the loneliness hit hardest. The holiday seasons, with all their supposed joy, only served to remind him of what he never had. While other kids were celebrating with their families, opening presents and sharing warmth, Tim was just trying to survive, trying to make it through another night. And even as an adult, even with a career and a place to call his own, that deep-seated loneliness never truly went away. Tim's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he remembered those nights in the group homes, dark, cold, and filled with the kind of emptiness that gnawed at his soul. He had learned to become numb to the feeling, to bury it under a facade of professionalism and calm. But meeting Andy tonight, seeing the boy sitting alone in the snow, feeling that coldness seep into his own bones, stirred something inside him. Andy's pain was familiar. The way he had looked at Tim, the way he had clung to Cola for warmth, it all reminded him too much of himself as a child. Tim knew that feeling all too well. He knew what it was like to feel unwanted, to think that no one would come for you, to believe that you were just a burden, just someone passing through other people's lives without leaving a mark. Tim glanced in the rearview mirror at Andy, who was now sitting quietly in the back seat, his small frame huddled against Cola. The boy's eyes were closed, but Tim could see the tension still held in his body. He wasn't sure if Andy felt safe yet, but he was determined to give him that chance, to offer him something that he had never been given, a real chance at family, at love, at a life without fear. The road ahead seemed endless, the streetlights blurring into a haze as the car moved slowly through the snow-covered town. Tim's thoughts were heavy. He wondered if Andy too could one day find peace like he had. If the boy could learn to trust, to believe in something more than the cold and the silence. And yet, even as Tim promised himself that he would help Andy, a small voice in the back of his mind questioned his own ability to keep that promise. Could he really be the one to save this boy? Or was he doomed to repeat the same cycle of abandonment and disappointment he had known all his life? The sound of Cola's steady breathing in the back seat brought him back to the present. The dog's quiet presence, so sure and unwavering, was a comfort to Tim. He couldn't help but think how, in a way, Cola had saved him too. The dog had become his anchor, his partner in a world that often felt too uncertain. Tim's hands loosened on the steering wheel as he turned down a quieter street. He wasn't sure what the future held for Andy or for him, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, he could help this boy find the home and the love he deserved. Tim's thoughts swirled as he drove through the quiet streets, the soft glow of streetlights casting fleeting shadows over the snow-covered town, As the cruiser pulled into the familiar neighborhood, his heart began to race. He had made a promise to Andy. He would be safe tonight, away from the cold and the neglect. But now he had to face the reality of returning Andy to the home that had caused him so much pain. Tim turned onto Elm Street, a row of small, weathered houses with unkempt lawns and peeling paint. He had passed by this block countless times, but never truly noticed the stories hidden behind each door. Tonight, those stories felt all too real, especially when it came to Andy's aunt and uncle. He parked the cruiser in front of the house, the headlights illuminating the dim, crumbling porch. Fred and Linda, Andy's aunt and uncle, stood just inside the door, waiting. Tim's eyes narrowed as he saw Fred's posture, arms crossed, shoulders stiff. Tim knew what to expect: tension, anger, defensiveness. He was about to walk into a battle he didn't want to fight, but he knew it was necessary. For Andy. Cola, sensing the change in atmosphere, stood in the back seat, his muscles tensed. Tim placed a hand on the dog's head, his mind already racing through the steps ahead. He would take Andy in. He had already made that decision. The question now was how to face the two people who had failed him. As Tim opened the cruiser door, Andy shifted in the back seat. His eyes flicked nervously to the house. Tim saw the flicker of doubt in his gaze, but it was quickly replaced by a flash of something else: resignation. Andy had lived this scene before. He knew what was coming. "Stay close, buddy," Tim said quietly, glancing at Cola, who was already by his side, sensing the tension in the air. They walked toward the door, the snow crunching beneath their boots. Tim knocked firmly, and the door creaked open, revealing Fred's scowling face. Linda stood behind him, her arms crossed tightly. "Officer Carter," Fred said curtly, his voice sharp with irritation, "what are you doing here?" "I'm here to return Andy," Tim replied, keeping his voice even. "He was found out in the cold tonight, and I'm not leaving him here." Fred stepped forward, his face reddening. "You've got no business taking him. He's our responsibility," Fred snapped, his voice rising. Tim didn't flinch. "Your responsibility? Fred, you've done nothing but neglect him. He's been running away from you for weeks. You think that's acceptable?" The words hung in the air, thick with tension. Andy stood behind Tim, eyes lowered, arms wrapped around himself. Tim could feel the weight of his silence. The boy wasn't just scared. He was resigned, as if expecting to be pushed aside again. Linda spoke up, her voice low and cold. "He's just being dramatic. He's fine here. We don't need anyone telling us how to raise our own nephew." Tim's blood boiled. "You call this raising him? You've done nothing but break him down. He deserves better." Just then, Fred's anger erupted. He stepped forward, his hand reaching for Andy, pulling him roughly by the arm. "You're going inside, Andy, now." In that instant, Cola sprang into action. The dog growled low, a deep, rumbling sound that filled the air. Cola stood between Fred and Andy, his large body blocking the way. His posture was firm, his eyes locked on Fred, who froze in place. Tim stood still, watching as the tension in the air thickened. Fred looked at Cola, then back at Tim. "What the hell is this?" Fred sneered. "You think you can just walk in here and take him?" Tim's voice was steady but firm. "If you touch him again, I'll arrest you for child endangerment." For a moment, there was silence. The only sound was the soft crunch of the snow beneath their feet. Tim could feel the weight of the situation, the anger, the fear, the injustice. But amidst it all, Cola's presence stood as an undeniable shield, a reminder that not all was lost. Fred took a step back, his face flushed with rage, but unwilling to challenge Tim's authority any further. Linda said nothing, her gaze cold and distant. Andy, still standing behind Tim, seemed smaller than ever. But there was something in his eyes now, a flicker of hope. Tim turned to Andy, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "You're coming with me. You're safe now." Andy looked up, his eyes filled with uncertainty, but there was a new kind of trust in them. "You promise?" he asked, his voice small but hopeful. "I promise," Tim said firmly, his gaze locking with Andy's. "Let's go home." Cola gave a soft huff as Tim opened the door of the cruiser. He helped Andy into the back seat, the boy curling up against Cola for warmth. Tim took one last look at the house, at the broken promises, the walls that had once been home, and closed the door with a soft click. The cruiser's engine hummed steadily as Tim drove through the silent streets of Silver Springs, the dim glow of street lights illuminating the snow-covered roads. The weight of the decision settled heavily in his chest. He had promised Andy safety, but now that promise felt more urgent than ever. As they neared the town's edge where Andy's aunt and uncle lived, Tim felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew what awaited them there. The house was full of coldness not just in temperature, but in the way the adults treated Andy, in the words they used, in the silence that consumed the boy whenever he was around them. Tim's grip tightened on the wheel. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror where Andy sat in the back seat, curled up against Cola, his small hands gripping the dog's fur. Despite the warmth of the car, Andy looked fragile, as if any sudden movement could shatter the trust he had just begun to place in Tim. Tim had never expected this night to go the way it had. He had hoped for a peaceful shift, but what had happened changed everything. He couldn't, in good conscience, drop Andy back off at a house that had been nothing but a prison for him, a house where Andy had been mistreated, ignored, and told time and time again that he wasn't wanted. Tim's mind raced. He knew what had to be done. He glanced at Andy again, catching the boy's eyes in the rearview mirror. Andy was looking out the window, his gaze distant. The faintest trace of worry still lingered on his face. Tim's voice broke the silence, steady but filled with emotion. "Andy," he said softly, "I'm not taking you back there." Andy turned his head slowly, his eyes wide. "What do you mean?" His voice was soft, unsure. "But they're my family." Tim's heart clenched at the fear in the boy's voice. He knew what that fear felt like. He had lived it for years, the fear of being unwanted, of being sent back to a place where no one cared. "I know they're your family, but they haven't been treating you like one," Tim said, his voice unwavering. "And you deserve more than that. You deserve a place where you're safe, where you're cared for, a place where you matter." Andy's lips trembled, his eyes glistening with tears. I don't know what that feels like." His voice cracked, and for the first time Tim saw just how broken the boy was. The air between them felt thick with unspoken emotions. Tim could feel the weight of Andy's words pressing down on him, making him ache in a way he hadn't expected. But it also fueled his determination. He wouldn't let Andy go back to a life where he was nothing more than a burden. "I'm going to make sure you're safe," Tim continued, glancing at Andy in the mirror. "I promise, Andy. No more hurt, no more fear. I'm here for you now." There was a long silence in the car, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever. But in that silence, Tim felt a shift. It was subtle, but it was there. Andy looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time without the shadow of fear in his eyes. "Thank you," Andy whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with sincerity. Tim's heart swelled. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment he knew he had made the right decision. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what would happen next. But he knew this. Andy wouldn't have to suffer anymore. And for that, Tim would do whatever it took. As the car continued down the road, the weight of his decision began to feel lighter. For the first time in a long time, Tim allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could provide Andy the family and love he had never known. The cruiser's headlights cut through the darkness as Tim drove toward the police station. The town was quiet, the snow falling gently around them, blanketing everything in a soft, peaceful white. But within the walls of the Silver Springs Police Department, there was a different kind of warmth, one that Andy had never known before. When Tim pulled into the parking lot, Andy looked around at the building, a slight frown on his face. The harshness of his past still lingered in his expression, but it was slowly beginning to soften. He was no longer out in the cold, no longer alone. Tim had kept his promise, and now the boy would experience something he hadn't in a long time: safety. As Tim helped Andy out of the cruiser, Cola trotted beside them, his presence comforting, as always. The police station was lit up with the soft glow of Christmas decorations, simple strings of lights around the windows, a small tree in the lobby, and a wreath on the door. It wasn't the kind of Christmas celebration Andy might have imagined, but it was warm. It was real. Inside, the warmth of the building greeted them. A few officers were still at their desks, working late into the night, but there was a different feeling in the air tonight. The usual hum of fluorescent lights was softened by the atmosphere of the holiday. The air smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and there was a steady quietness, the kind of peace that came with being surrounded by people who cared about something larger than themselves. "Hey, Tim," called out Daniel, one of the officers, as he noticed them walking in. Daniel was a big guy with a calm demeanor and a deep sense of empathy, especially when it came to kids. He saw Andy and gave him a friendly nod, offering a small, reassuring smile. Tim gave him a quick wave and led Andy toward a corner where a small break area had been set up for the officers working that night. "Andy," Tim said softly, bending down to his level, "you're going to be okay here. I'll be right outside. You just stay with Cola, all right?" Andy nodded, but his eyes flickered nervously toward the officers and the unfamiliar surroundings. Is it okay here?" Andy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tim smiled gently. "It's more than okay. You're safe here, Andy. You're not alone." He placed a hand on Andy's shoulder, squeezing it just a little to reassure him. Cola, sensing Andy's unease, sat down beside him, his large body acting as an unspoken shield. Andy hesitated for a moment, then slowly leaned into Cola's warmth, his small frame relaxing as the dog's steady presence gave him a sense of comfort. The officers continued with their work, but there was a sense of shared understanding. Tim saw them glance at Andy, their expressions softening as they realized what was unfolding. No one spoke much, but the quiet solidarity in the room was palpable. This wasn't just another night at the station, it was a night that would mark a turning point for Andy. Tim took a step back, watching as Andy slowly settled into the corner, leaning against Cola. He could see the boy's shoulders slowly relax, the tension that had held him so tightly for so long beginning to ease. The boy had been running for so long, carrying the weight of his past with him. But here, in this small, humble police station, Andy was finding something new, something that had been denied to him for far too long: security. As the night wore on, more officers came and went, and some paused to offer the occasional kind word to Andy. They were careful, gentle, understanding that this was no ordinary night. This was Christmas Eve, and this child deserved a bit of peace, even if only for tonight. Tim stood by the door for a moment, watching the scene unfold. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider in his own life. He wasn't just an officer or a man carrying the weight of his own past. Tonight, he was part of something. He was part of a family. Not the family he was born into, but the family he had chosen, the one he was helping to build. It wasn't blood that made a family. It was love. It was the willingness to protect. It was the promise that no one would be left behind. Tim's eyes lingered on Andy for a moment longer. The boy was curled up with Cola, his breathing slow and even, a far cry from the trembling, terrified child he had been just hours before. Tim's heart warmed as he turned to leave the room. He could hear the soft murmur of the officers in the next room, the crackling sound of the radio, the distant hum of the coffee machine. But most of all, he could hear the sound of something he hadn't allowed himself to hear in years: peace. The quiet of the police station felt different now. It was a soft kind of quiet, punctuated by the occasional shuffle of papers or the faint sound of an officer's shoes against the floor. The usual buzz of radios and telephones was muted by the presence of the child, the small, fragile being who had arrived in such an unexpected way. Tim stood at the counter, watching as Officer Marlene Ruiz poured a steaming mug of hot chocolate, her hands steady as she worked. She was a calm, no-nonsense woman who had always been a quiet force at the station, and tonight she was proving that yet again. She handed the mug to Andy, who sat at the small table in the break room, still curled up in Tim's jacket, his small frame wrapped in the warmth of something he had not felt for far too long. "Here you go, Andy," Marlene said softly, placing the mug in front of him. "It's hot, but it'll help." Andy's eyes met hers, a flicker of uncertainty still in his gaze. But when he wrapped his hands around the mug, he let out a small, shaky sigh as if the warmth was more than just physical. It was a comfort, a reassurance that everything would be okay. He took a careful sip, eyes darting between Marlene and Tim as though checking to see if this was real, if he was really safe. Tim watched from the doorway, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He wasn't sure what had moved him more, the sight of his colleagues taking such gentle care of Andy or the quiet realization that this was the first time the boy was being treated with true kindness in a long time. Marlene had gone above and beyond, her natural instinct to protect showing through with every gentle word, every careful gesture. Nearby, Officer Daniel Price set down a plate of food, a simple sandwich and some fruit. It was nothing extravagant, but for Andy, it might as well have been a feast. "Here you go," Daniel said, giving Andy a friendly wink. "Eat what you can. We've got plenty if you want more." Andy hesitated, glancing at the food, then at Cola, who had sat down beside him. The German shepherd had hardly moved from his side since they arrived. His dark eyes were fixed on Andy, the weight of his gaze as protective as a shield. It was as if the dog knew exactly what the boy needed: comfort, safety, and the reassurance that no one would hurt him tonight. Andy reached for the sandwich, his fingers trembling slightly, and took a small bite. His eyes stayed on Cola, and with each chew, his posture softened. He wasn't looking over his shoulder anymore, wasn't listening for footsteps that might mean trouble. The space around him felt warmer, safer. Tim walked over and knelt beside the table, placing a hand on Andy's shoulder. "You're doing great, buddy," he said softly. "You're safe here. We're going to make sure of that." Andy looked up at him, his expression still uncertain, but there was a flicker of something else. Hope, maybe. It was small, barely there, but it was the beginning of something. He didn't say anything, but his shoulders relaxed just a little bit more. And then there was Cola. The dog had not once moved from Andy's side, sitting calmly next to the boy, his warm body offering silent reassurance. Every so often, Cola would nudge Andy gently with his nose, as if reminding him that he was still there, still protecting him. It was these quiet moments, these simple gestures, that began to chip away at the walls Andy had built around himself. Cola wasn't just a dog, he was a lifeline, and Andy needed that lifeline more than anyone could understand. The officers moved quietly around the room, giving Andy the space he needed, but their presence was constant. Each one of them, Marlene, Daniel, and the others, had already shown more care and compassion than Andy had ever known from the people who were supposed to love him. Tim stood back watching it all unfold. For the first time since he had met Andy, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about doing his job. It wasn't just about the case, the paperwork, or the protocols. This was about making sure Andy knew that no matter what happened, he wasn't alone. He wasn't a burden. He wasn't forgotten. And as Andy finished the last of his sandwich and took another sip of his hot chocolate, Tim felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, Andy could start to trust again. He could start to believe in something better than the cold, something better than the neglect he had endured for so long. The next few hours at the police station passed slowly, but in a way, that was a blessing. Andy had finally settled into the rhythm of the place, though the progress was small, almost imperceptible. Still, Tim watched closely, every glance at Andy and Cola offering him a glimpse of the boy's slow, careful shift. Andy's posture was different now. At first, he had kept his head down, his body hunched in on itself, as though expecting the world to crush him at any moment. But now, as he sat with Cola, who was curled up next to him like a constant living barrier between him and the world, Andy's shoulders were starting to relax. His eyes, once darting nervously around the room, now met Tim's with growing trust, though still cautious. The police station was quiet, save for the occasional sound of keys or the shuffle of papers, but there was a subtle shift in the air. The tension in Andy's frame had lessened. He still flinched when someone moved too quickly or raised their voice, but he wasn't shrinking into the corner anymore. He was starting to accept the gentle presence of the officers around him. Marlene had taken a break from her duties and sat down at the table across from Andy, offering him a soft smile. We don't bite, she said playfully, trying to break through the last of his walls. Andy looked at her, his eyes wide, uncertain, but there was something in his gaze, a flicker of curiosity. You don't? Andy asked quietly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It was the first time Tim had seen him even attempt a smile. Nope, Marlene replied, her tone light and warm. We're just here to help. Nothing more. Andy didn't respond right away, but Tim saw the small shift. The boy was beginning to understand that these people, these officers, were not here to hurt him. They were here to protect him. They weren't like the others who had only ever given him pain. Tim watched as Andy slowly leaned back in his chair, his fingers absently stroking Cola's fur. The German Shepherd remained as ever, his eyes alert but relaxed, sensing Andy's every movement, his every thought. The dog's calm, steady presence was a constant reminder to the boy that he wasn't alone, that there was someone who would always stand by his side. Andy, for the first time in what seemed like forever, felt safe. And Cola was a huge part of that. The bond between the two was growing with every passing minute. Cola was no longer just a dog assigned to Tim. He was a protector, a friend, a companion to the boy who had been left to fend for himself for far too long. In those quiet moments, as Cola sat by Andy's side, Tim couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. The dog had an innate understanding of what Andy needed. No commands, no instructions, just presence. As the night wore on, Tim stayed close by, but not too close, letting Andy have the space he needed. Tim knew that trust didn't come overnight, and he wasn't about to rush it. But there was a shift, a quiet but undeniable shift in Andy's demeanor. The boy wasn't as tense. His eyes were no longer constantly scanning the room for a threat. He was starting to believe that he could finally rest, that he could trust. Even when Andy's eyes fluttered closed and his breathing slowed, the tension in his small body eased, he was still with them. He was still safe. And Tim, in that moment, knew that this was only the beginning of Andy's healing. This small, fragile boy was learning to believe in something better, something beyond the hurt, beyond the past that had broken him. Cola's head rested gently on Andy's lap, and Tim watched the boy's hand slowly move, almost without thinking, to rest on the dog's head. The action was so simple, but it was everything. It was Andy's first real step toward opening up, toward beginning to trust again. The quiet buzz of the police station was broken only by the low hum of radios and the soft shuffle of papers. Tim sat at his desk, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure of where to begin. He knew the next step in protecting Andy was understanding the full extent of his situation. Who were the people that were supposed to care for him, and what had they done to him? Tim's gaze shifted to the boy sitting on the couch, Cola lying beside him, his head resting gently on Andy's feet. The small, steady rise and fall of Andy's chest was the most peaceful thing Tim had seen in hours. But peace, he knew, was temporary. It was only a fraction of what the boy needed. Tim had already made the decision to take Andy in, but now he had to uncover the truth about his family. What had led to Andy being abandoned in the first place? Why had his aunt and uncle treated him this way? It was time to find answers. After a few quiet moments, Tim stood and left the break room, his mind set on the next step, talking to the neighbors. He'd spent enough time working the streets of Silver Springs to know that people had their own stories to tell. All he had to do was listen. The first door he knocked on belonged to Mrs. Evelyn Marks, a retired school teacher who had lived on Elm Street for more years than Tim could count. She opened the door slowly, peering out through the glass. "Yes, officer?" she asked, her voice polite but wary. "Good evening, Mrs. Marks," Tim said, flashing his badge. "I'm just checking in on a case involving a young boy, Andy Brooks. I was hoping you could tell me if you've seen anything unusual around the house recently, or if you know anything about his family situation." Mrs. Marks hesitated before inviting him inside. They sat at her small kitchen table, a faint smell of coffee still lingering in the air. "Andy," she said softly, shaking her head. "He's a sweet boy, always polite, always well-behaved, but his aunt and uncle, Well, let's just say they weren't what you'd call loving. They've had their fair share of problems, and Andy was always the one who seemed to get the brunt of it. Tim's heart sank as she continued. I remember hearing raised voices late at night, but I always assumed it was just family stuff. But I saw him out here once last winter, sitting on the steps with no coat, no shoes, just staring at the snow. I thought it was strange, but when I asked Linda about it, she just shrugged it off, said Andy had probably gotten into trouble at school. Her voice cracked with emotion. I should have done more, but I didn't want to make things worse for him. She paused, then looked up at Tim. I'm sorry, officer. I know I should have stepped in. I knew he was suffering. Tim nodded, feeling a deep sense of empathy. It wasn't just the neglect Andy had suffered. It was the silence of those who had seen it and done nothing. He understood. He knew how easy it was to ignore the signs, to look the other way, especially when fear kept you from speaking out. Thank you, Mrs. Marks, Tim said gently, his voice filled with gratitude. It takes courage to speak up, and I'm glad you did. He left her house with a heavy heart, but a clearer picture of what had been happening behind closed doors. The next few houses yielded similar stories. Neighbors who had heard the arguments, seen the neglect, but had kept quiet for fear of retaliation. Slowly, the truth about Andy's situation began to surface, and it was worse than Tim had imagined. As he made his way back to the station, his phone buzzed with a message from Marlene. I spoke to some others. Seems like Andy wasn't just neglected. There's more. We need to dig deeper into Fred and Linda's past. Tim's gut twisted. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach churn. The walls around Andy's life had been built on neglect and fear, and now it was clear this wasn't just an unhappy home, it was a place where abuse had taken root. As he entered the station, the weight of what he had uncovered hung heavy in the air, but there was no time to dwell on the horror of it. Tim knew what he had to do now. He had to protect Andy, and that meant taking the next step, one that would change everything. Tim sat at his desk, the flickering light of his computer screen casting a pale glow over the quiet room. He couldn't stop thinking about Andy. The truth of the boy's situation, everything he had learned in the last few hours, was more than just neglect. It was cruelty, it was fear. It was a broken home that had destroyed every part of Andy's spirit. The images from his conversations with the neighbors still lingered in Tim's mind. The things they had told him, how they had seen Andy neglected, ignored, and mistreated, hit him harder than anything he had ever encountered on the job. And yet, despite all of it, Andy had been resilient. He had fought through it. He had survived. And that was why Tim had to make this decision. He knew what he had to do. The office door opened softly, and Marlene stepped in holding a stack of papers. Tim, she said quietly, noticing the weight in his eyes, I've got the background checks on Fred and Linda. You were right to dig deeper. Tim ran a hand through his hair, rubbing his temples. It's worse than we thought, he muttered, his voice tinged with exhaustion. I can't send Andy back to them. He can't go back to that house. Not now, not ever. Marlene nodded, her face serious. I know. We've got enough to make a case, but we'll need to act fast. They've been slipping through the cracks for too long. Tim took a deep breath, looking at the papers in front of him. He wasn't a man prone to rushing decisions. He had seen enough of the world to know that hasty actions often led to regret. But this was different. Andy needed more than just protection. He needed a future. And Tim knew that he was the one who had to give it to him. Get me the paperwork, Tim said, his voice firm. I'm filing the adoption request for Andy. Marlene paused for a moment, surprised by the weight of his words. Then she nodded, understanding what Tim was saying. Are you sure? I mean, this is a big step, Tim. It's not just about protecting him now. It's about giving him a home. A real home. Tim's heart clenched as he looked down at the desk, his fingers tracing the edge of a folder. He thought about Andy's face. The fear, the confusion, the tiny spark of hope he had seen when the boy finally started to trust him. That spark had been buried under so much pain, but it was there. Tim could see it, and he couldn't let it fade away. I'm sure, Tim said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He doesn't deserve to be alone anymore. He deserves to know what it feels like to have someone who will never turn away. He deserves a family, and I'm going to give that to him. Tim stood up from his desk, his heart pounding as he walked over to the small room where Andy was waiting. As he entered, he saw the boy still sitting quietly, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Kola was beside him, resting his head on the boy's knee, offering silent comfort. Tim walked over and knelt down in front of Andy, looking him in the eyes. The boy met his gaze, his expression still uncertain, but there was something different in his eyes now. A flicker of hope, a hint of trust. "Andy," Tim said gently, his voice soft but full of certainty, "I need to tell you something important." Andy looked up at him, his eyes wide. "What is it?" he asked, his voice small, hesitant. Tim took a deep breath, his heart swelling as he spoke the words he had known he had to say. "You're not alone anymore, Andy. You're safe now. And I promise you this, no matter what happens, you'll never have to face the world alone again. I want you to be a part of my family. I'm going to adopt you. You're going to have a real family, a home where you're loved." Andy's breath caught in his throat. For a moment he said nothing, his eyes filling with disbelief. Tim could see the walls around him begin to crack, slowly but surely. "Do you mean it?" Andy asked, his voice barely a whisper. I'll have a family?" Tim smiled softly, his heart full. "Yes, Andy, a family. You'll always have a place with me. No more running. No more being alone." Andy's face crumpled for a moment, his lip trembling as tears welled up in his eyes, but then he reached out, his small hands gripping Tim's shoulders. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't want to be alone anymore. I want to be with you." Tim pulled him into a gentle hug, feeling the boy's small body tremble in his arms. For the first time, Andy wasn't fighting against the world. He wasn't trying to hide his pain. He was letting go, trusting Tim with the part of him that had been locked away for so long. As they pulled apart, Tim looked at Andy with a smile, his heart full. "You'll never be alone again, Andy. I promise you that." The first few days after Andy's arrival at Tim's house were a whirlwind of adjustment. The cold, sterile environment of the police station had been replaced by the warmth of a real home, Tim's home. But while the warmth of the house enveloped Andy, the reality of this new life hit him hard. Tim had thought he was prepared for everything. He had spent years training to be a protector, to solve cases, to offer help. But protecting a child, especially one as broken as Andy, wasn't as simple as offering shelter. It wasn't just about keeping the boy safe. It was about helping him rebuild the trust he had lost, teaching him how to be part of something bigger than himself. Andy's first morning in the house was the beginning of that struggle. He had slept in Tim's spare bedroom, the sheets still crisp, the bed unfamiliar. When Tim knocked gently on the door, Andy's voice was small, almost too quiet to hear. "I'm up," he mumbled. When Tim entered the room, he found Andy sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, his hands clutching the blanket tightly around his body. For a moment, the boy looked so small, so fragile, as if he were still bracing himself for something bad to happen. Tim stood there, watching for a moment, unsure of how to approach. He had promised Andy safety, but Andy wasn't used to safety. It was something he had never been given. "Morning, Andy," Tim said softly, moving to sit on the bed beside him. "How'd you sleep?" Andy shrugged, his eyes avoiding Tim's. "It's okay. Different," he said quietly, his voice still carrying a hint of hesitation. "I don't know what to do." Tim nodded, his heart aching for the boy. "I know it's a big change, but we'll take it one step at a time, all right? You don't have to figure it all out right away." For the first time since Andy had arrived, Tim saw something shift in the boy's expression. It was brief, but Andy's lips parted, as if he was going to say something, but then he fell silent again. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was the silence of two people. One, an adult who had learned to be patient, and the other, a child learning to trust. Over the next few days, the small victories started to show. At the dinner table, Andy ate without rushing, Without looking over his shoulder for someone to snatch his food away, he even started to talk a little. Though it was slow at first, questions about school, about the neighbors, about how the house worked. Tim tried to make it as normal as possible, setting clear routines and offering Andy small choices to make him feel involved. "What kind of cereal do you want this morning?" Tim would ask, and Andy's hesitant response was always followed by a small smile. But there were setbacks too. The first time Andy had been asked to do something by Tim, something as simple as putting his dirty dishes in the sink, the boy froze. His eyes widened in fear, his body stiffening. Tim watched closely, not sure what was coming next. "Andy?" Tim asked gently, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's okay. You're not in trouble." Andy looked up at him, his eyes full of something Tim couldn't quite read. It was the same look of uncertainty, of a child who expected to be punished for the smallest of mistakes. Tim didn't rush him, just waited. And after a moment, Andy slowly moved to the sink and placed his dish there, his shoulders hunched but the fear in his eyes beginning to ease. That was the moment Tim knew. Andy was starting to change. He was starting to trust. Slowly, like peeling back the layers of a wound too deep to heal quickly, Andy was allowing himself to be part of something. He was beginning to believe that no matter what happened, no one would abandon him. Tim watched these changes quietly, his heart both full and heavy. The boy was learning that life didn't have to be a fight, that he could make choices, that his actions had consequences, and that those consequences would be fair. The boy was learning that love wasn't conditional and neither was safety. But Tim also knew the truth. The change wasn't instant. The hurt that Andy had carried for so long wouldn't vanish overnight. Each day would be a small battle. But with Cola beside him and Tim's quiet presence, Andy was beginning to believe in something better. The first day of school came faster than Andy had expected. He had always dreaded the thought of returning to a classroom. He wasn't sure if it was the fear of being judged or the worry of not fitting in, but today was different. Tim had made sure to reassure him the night before, offering words of encouragement that Andy had never heard before. "You'll be okay. Just be yourself, and don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong." It was a strange feeling, knowing that someone actually believed in him, but it was comforting. When Andy woke up that morning, there was a sense of calm that had never been there before. The thought of facing a classroom full of strangers didn't seem as terrifying as it once had. Tim made breakfast, the smell of pancakes filling the house, and Andy found himself sitting at the table, not rushing, not watching the clock, just eating quietly as he listened to Tim's soft chatter about the day ahead. Cola, as always, sat beside him, waiting for his share of the morning scraps. The dog's constant presence was a reminder to Andy that he wasn't alone. Not anymore. When they arrived at the school, Tim walked him inside, a comforting presence at his side. Andy had to admit that the weight in his chest had lessened. The school was quiet. The students mostly focused on getting to class, but Andy's heart was still racing. His palms were sweaty, and his mind replayed every possible scenario in which he could mess up. Would the kids talk to him? Would they notice he was different? Would they hurt him like the others? "Remember," Tim said, bending down to Andy's level, "you don't have to do this alone. Cola and I are right here. I'll be here after school, and Cola will be waiting for you at home." Tim ruffled his hair, a gesture that felt more like a father than a protector. Andy nodded, feeling his throat tighten, but instead of pulling away, he held on to the words Tim had given him. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. The first class wasn't as bad as Andy had feared. He walked into the room with a sense of caution, sitting at the desk nearest the window. The teacher, Mrs. Stone, welcomed him with a warm smile, which surprised Andy. It was so rare for people to be kind to him, especially adults. A few of the kids glanced his way, but no one pointed or made him feel out of place. For the first time in a long time, Andy felt like he was allowed to just be. No pressure, no judgment. But there were moments when his gaze would drift to the door, or he would hear the snickers of kids nearby, and he would shrink back, as if expecting to be targeted. But every time he did, he felt a soft nudge against his side. It was Cola, always there, even in his mind, always protecting him from the worst. By lunchtime, Andy was doing better than he had thought possible. He sat down at an empty table, his lunch tray in front of him, and waited. After a few moments, a boy from his class, James, approached with a tray of his own. "Mind if I sit here?" James asked, his voice tentative but friendly. Andy blinked, surprised. Yeah, sure." James sat down, smiling. "I heard you just moved here. You're new, right?" "Yeah," Andy replied, trying to find his voice. "I'm Andy." "I'm James," the boy said, holding out his hand for a handshake. "If you need help catching up with anything, just let me know. I've been here forever." Andy felt a small smile tug at his lips. It was nice to have someone talk to him like he was just a regular kid, not someone who had to be fixed or pitied. They ate together in silence for a while, and Andy began to feel like he could actually be part of this place, like he wasn't the outsider anymore. As the bell rang and the students headed back to class, Andy felt a strange sensation settle in his chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anxiety. It was something else, something unfamiliar, a sense of belonging. And as he walked back to his next class, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. When the school day ended, Tim was waiting outside the gates, smiling proudly. Cola stood beside him, tail wagging gently. "How was your first day?" Tim asked, his voice filled with quiet pride. Andy's face lit up, and for the first time he didn't feel like hiding it. "It wasn't that bad," he said softly. "Actually, it was okay." Tim smiled, placing a hand on Andy's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, kid." And as they walked home together with Cola trailing along beside them, Andy realized something. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. For the first time, he was beginning to believe that maybe he could have a real life. A life full of chances, of moments that didn't have to be filled with fear. He had a family now, and that made all the difference. The Christmas lights twinkled softly, casting a warm glow across the living room. It had been 1 year since Andy had come to live with Tim, 1 year since the boy had been given a chance at a life he could finally call his own. Tim stood by the tree, carefully arranging the ornaments, while Cola rested by the fireplace, his tail thumping rhythmically against the floor. The house smelled of cinnamon and pine, and the sound of Christmas music played softly in the background. For the first time, Andy could feel the warmth in the air, not just from the fire or the decorations, but from the people around him. This was his home now, and for the first time, he was part of something. Tim had made it clear from the start that this Christmas would be different. There would be no more empty dinners or quiet, lonely nights. There would be family, real family, the kind that gathered around a table, the kind that celebrated together, the kind that made memories. As Tim adjusted the star on top of the tree, he glanced over at Andy, who was sitting on the couch, staring at the presents stacked beneath the tree. Cola, ever the faithful companion, had settled next to him, and Andy absently scratched the dog's ears. A small smile tugged at the corners of his lips, but there was still a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "Hey, buddy," Tim said, walking over to him. "You feeling okay?" Andy nodded, but his voice was quiet. "Yeah, I think so." Tim sat down next to him, looking at the tree. "It's been a big year, hasn't it?" "Yeah," Andy said, his voice a little stronger now. "It's been good. I mean, I didn't know Christmas could be like this." Tim chuckled, a deep warmth in his chest. "Well, it's all about making new memories, right? And no one's ever too old for a little holiday magic." Andy looked up at him, the flicker of doubt in his eyes still lingering. "I never had this before," he admitted. I never thought I could have a real Christmas." Tim's heart ached for the boy. It was moments like this, moments of raw honesty, that reminded him of just how far Andy had come. He wasn't just a child learning to trust, he was a child learning to believe in love, in family, in safety. "It's not about the presents or the decorations, Andy," Tim said, his voice filled with sincerity. "It's about being with the people who care about you, about feeling like you belong, and you belong here, with me, with Cola." Andy turned his head, his eyes meeting Tim's. For a moment the room felt still, like time had stopped just for them. Then slowly Andy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wrapped gift. His hand shook slightly as he held it out to Tim. Tim looked at the gift, then back at Andy. "What's this?" he asked, his voice filled with surprise. I wanted to give you something," Andy said, his voice soft but sincere. "It's not much, but it's for you. For being my family." Tim took the gift, his hands trembling slightly as he unwrapped it. Inside was a small picture frame with a photo of Andy, Tim, and Cola. The picture was taken just a few weeks ago. Tim had set up the camera and asked Andy to sit beside him and Cola for a picture. The photo showed them all laughing, with Cola's big ears flopping in the wind. Tim's eyes welled up as he held the frame in his hands. He hadn't realized how much he needed this moment, the feeling that they were truly a family, that Andy was truly a part of his life. For so long, Tim had lived in the shadow of his past, carrying the weight of loneliness and regret. But tonight, as he looked at the photo, he felt something shift. The pain that had lingered in his chest for so long seemed to dissolve, replaced by something stronger, something more enduring. Love. Tim looked at Andy, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered. "You don't know what this means to me." Andy's face softened, and for the first time he smiled fully, a smile that reached his eyes, that lit up his entire face. "You're welcome," he said quietly, his voice full of warmth. The two of them sat there in the glow of the Christmas tree, surrounded by the love and warmth that had once felt so foreign to Andy. In that moment, he knew that no matter what the future held, this was his family now, and he was finally home. The warmth of the Christmas night lingered in the air, but for Andy there was still a quiet ache, a memory he couldn't quite shake off. It had been weeks since he had moved into Tim's home, since he had found safety in this new family, but the shadows of his past were never far behind. They crept in when he least expected it, in the moments when the house was too quiet, or when he was alone in his room staring at the walls. It wasn't the physical pain anymore, not like it used to be. There were no more angry voices or hands that hurt, but there were still moments when Andy felt small, when the weight of loneliness pressed down on him again. Times when the quiet was deafening and the fear from his old life would return in waves, making him feel like he was back in that place, the place where he wasn't wanted, where he wasn't seen. That night, after the presents were opened and the holiday celebrations had wound down, Andy lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. His fingers brushed against the small picture frame on his bedside table. It was the same photo he had given to Tim earlier, a memory of that first Christmas together, but as he looked at it now, something stirred inside him. He wasn't sure if it was guilt or fear, but the unease gnawed at his insides. He closed his eyes, and for a moment the images from his past came rushing back. The cold, dark house, the angry voices, the feeling of being invisible, of being nothing more than a burden. The memories haunted him, and no matter how hard he tried to push them away, they were there, waiting in the dark corners of his mind. Andy's breath hitched as he pulled the blankets tighter around him, but just as quickly he felt something soft and warm brush against his leg. It was Cola, who had slipped into his room without making a sound. The dog's presence was always a comfort, a steady reassurance that he wasn't alone. Cola curled up at the foot of the bed, his heavy body providing a comforting weight. Andy reached down and ran his fingers through the dog's fur, the softness grounding him, pushing the memories away. Tim's voice came from the hallway, soft but clear. "Andy, you okay?" Andy hesitated for a moment, then called back, "Yeah, just thinking." Tim didn't say anything at first, but Andy could hear his footsteps coming closer. The door creaked open and Tim peeked inside, his face bathed in the soft glow from the hallway light. "You're still awake?" Tim asked, his tone gentle, understanding. "You don't have to hide in here, you know." Andy sat up slowly, his heart racing, not sure how to explain the feeling of emptiness that sometimes crept up on him. He shook his head, unsure of how to put it into words. I don't know if I can stop thinking about everything." about about how things used to be. Tim stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind him. I know it's hard, buddy, but you're not there anymore. You're not that kid anymore. You're here. With me, with Cola. Andy looked up at him, his eyes wide with uncertainty. I don't know if I can ever feel normal again. Sometimes it just feels too quiet here. Tim smiled softly and sat beside Andy on the bed. The quiet can be scary sometimes, I know. But it's not a bad thing, Andy. It's just peace. Something you've never had before, and it's okay to be scared of it. But I promise it'll get easier. The more you let yourself feel safe, the easier it will be. For a moment, Andy just sat there listening to Tim's words. There was truth in them, even if it didn't feel real just yet. But for the first time, Andy allowed himself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could have peace. He could have the freedom to choose his life, to live without fear, without running. I'm here for you, Tim continued, his hand resting lightly on Andy's shoulder. You get to decide what happens next. You get to choose your future now. No more living in the shadows of the past. Andy took a deep breath, the weight in his chest starting to ease. He wasn't sure how long it would take to fully trust in this new life, but he felt something shift, something deep inside him, a seed of hope finally beginning to sprout. Thanks, Tim, Andy whispered, his voice barely audible. Tim squeezed his shoulder gently. You don't have to thank me, Andy. I'm not going anywhere. We'll do this together. With a soft sigh, Andy lay back down, his hand resting on Cola's warm, reassuring presence. The darkness in his room didn't seem so threatening anymore. For the first time, the quiet didn't feel so empty. And as he drifted off to sleep, he let himself believe, just for a moment, that he could live a life without fear. The months following that Christmas were full of change. Slowly, like the steady thaw of winter, Andy began to unravel the tightly wound knots of fear and insecurity he had carried for so long. He wasn't the same boy who had wandered the streets in the dark, hoping to find a place where he belonged. With each passing day, he started to believe in the possibility of a future, one where he was no longer defined by his past, but by his own choices. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, when the old fears would creep in, quiet, but insistent. Sometimes Andy would still wake up in the middle of the night, his heart pounding in his chest, convinced that someone was going to take everything away from him. But each time he remembered Tim's words, you get to decide what happens next, and that made all the difference. Tim noticed the change in Andy too. The boy was beginning to stand taller, to speak more confidently, to smile more freely. It was a subtle transformation, but it was there. He no longer shrank away from people. He no longer looked for the nearest exit whenever the room felt too crowded. One afternoon, they were out in the backyard, Andy tossing a ball for Cola, who chased it happily. Tim watched them, his heart swelling with pride. Cola had become a constant companion for Andy, his protector, his friend, his link to a world that no longer felt so threatening. And as he watched the bond between them grow stronger, Tim realized just how far they had come. From that cold, silent night in the abandoned house to this, the warmth of a home filled with love and laughter. Good throw, Andy, Tim called, grinning as Andy picked up another ball and sent it flying across the yard. Andy turned and smiled, his face alight with the carefree joy of a child who had finally found safety. Thanks, Tim, he called back. There was no hesitation in his voice now, no fear of rejection. He was confident, and it was a sound Tim would never grow tired of hearing. As the weeks went by, the changes in Andy became more evident. He started doing better at school, making friends, and engaging with the world around him. Tim had been right. Andy had been given the tools to build a new life, but it was up to him to use them. And he was doing just that. One evening, after a long day at school, Andy sat at the kitchen table doing his homework. Tim walked in with a cup of hot cocoa, placing it gently in front of him. How's the math going? Tim asked, his voice light but full of encouragement. Andy looked up from his work, a grin tugging at his lips. It's okay. I think I'm finally starting to get it. Tim chuckled, sitting down beside him. That's great. You're really starting to come into your own, Andy. Andy's eyes softened, and for a moment he paused as if considering Tim's words. Then he spoke, his voice quieter now. I never really thought I could be good at anything. I always thought I'd just mess up. Tim placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice gentle but firm. You were never meant to mess up, Andy. You just needed the right chance, the right people. And now, you've got both. Andy nodded, a deep sense of gratitude in his eyes. I'm glad it's you, Tim. I don't know what I would have done without you. Tim felt a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't just about doing his job or being a good foster parent. This was about creating something real. This was family, the kind he had always wanted and never thought he would have. You're not alone anymore, Andy. You're part of this family, and that's never going to change. As the evening wore on, Tim and Andy continued to talk about school, about dreams, about what the future might look like. And for the first time in a long while, Andy wasn't just surviving. He was living. He was learning to trust, to hope, and to dream. And Cola, ever the faithful companion, sat by their side, the silent anchor that held them together. Tim watched them both, feeling the warmth of the moment settle in his heart. He knew that the journey ahead would be long, with challenges and setbacks, but it would also be filled with love. And as he looked at Andy, a child who had found his place in the world, he realized that their journey together had only just begun. The peace that had settled into their home was disrupted one warm afternoon when Andy and Tim were out for a walk with Cola. They had spent the last several months building a life together, one that felt real, one that felt like family. But life had a way of reminding them that nothing came without challenges, and it came knocking when they least expected it. It was on Maple Street, just a few blocks from their house, when they passed by Ms. Hathaway's house, one of their neighbors. Ms. Hathaway had lived in the neighborhood for years and had always been polite but distant, a fixture of the quiet town. Andy had never spoken much to her, but he had nodded politely when she waved. This time, however, things were different. Ms. Hathaway was standing at the end of her driveway, a look of suspicion on her face as she watched Andy, Tim, and Cola walk by. Tim felt the shift in the air before he saw it in her eyes. Something had changed. As they got closer, Ms. Hathaway called out to them, her voice sharp and curt. "Excuse me, Officer Carter," she said, her tone colder than usual. "I hope you know what you're doing with that boy." Tim stopped in his tracks, his heart sinking slightly at the tension in her voice. Andy, who had been walking beside him, stiffened, his gaze dropping to the ground. Cola, sensing Andy's discomfort, stepped closer, his body brushing against the boy's leg. Tim looked at Ms. Hathaway, trying to keep his tone neutral. "What do you mean, Ms. Hathaway?" "I mean," she said, eyeing Andy carefully, "you've got a boy with a past. A boy who comes from a troubled family. I don't know if it's a good idea bringing that into a nice neighborhood like this." Andy's chest tightened at her words, and he instinctively took a step closer to Tim, as if hoping the space between them would shield him from the sting of her judgment. His hands were trembling again, and his heart began to race. He had hoped that the past would stay buried, but it seemed that it was coming back to haunt him. Tim's jaw clenched. He knew the judgment was coming. There was always someone in the community who would whisper behind closed doors, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean," Tim replied carefully, his voice calm, though there was a quiet steel behind it. "Andy is part of our family now. That's all that matters." Ms. Hathaway's expression hardened. "Well, that may be true for you, officer, but the rest of us aren't so sure. People like him don't just change overnight, you know. They bring their problems with them." Tim's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. "I think you're mistaken, Ms. Hathaway. Andy's past doesn't define him. It's what he does now that matters." Tim turned slightly, his body positioning itself between Ms. Hathaway and Andy. He could feel the boy's unease radiating behind him. The last thing he wanted was for Andy to feel exposed, to be made to feel like he didn't belong here. Ms. Hathaway seemed to sense the shift in Tim's stance. She huffed, muttered something under her breath, and turned back toward her house. Tim watched her go, but his thoughts were on Andy, who was now standing stiffly beside him, his eyes downcast. "Andy," Tim said gently, turning to face him, "you okay?" Andy didn't respond right away. His eyes were wide, his lips trembling. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. The fear, the old insecurities were crawling back, creeping in like they always had before. He was scared. Scared of being judged, scared of being rejected, scared of being nothing more than his past. Tim kneeled down in front of Andy, his hands resting gently on the boy's shoulders. "Hey," he said softly. "I know it's hard, but you have to remember this is your life now. You get to decide what you want to do with it." Andy looked up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "But what if people still look at me like that? Like I'm a mistake, like I don't belong here?" Tim smiled softly, his voice low and steady. "Then you show them who you are. You keep being the person you're becoming. You've already come so far. You're stronger than you think, Andy. You don't have to prove anything to anyone except yourself. This is your home, and you are a part of this family." Cola let out a soft whine, nudging Andy's hand with his nose as if offering his own quiet reassurance. Andy hesitated for a moment, then slowly, almost shyly, he reached down to scratch Cola behind the ears. "I don't know if I can do it," Andy murmured, his voice full of doubt. Tim chuckled softly. "It's okay to feel like that, but I know you can, and I'll be right here beside you every step of the way." Andy's face softened, and for the first time that day he let out a small, genuine smile. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Tim stood up, placing a hand on Andy's shoulder as they began to walk back home. It wasn't easy, this life they were building together. There would always be challenges, moments of doubt, moments when the past would try to resurface, but they would face it together. Andy had come a long way, and Tim wasn't about to let anything or anyone take that away from him. Life, for the first time, felt whole. The weeks passed, and as Andy continued to adjust to his new life with Tim and Cola, something inside him shifted. The empty spaces in his heart, the ones he had kept hidden for so long, began to fill with something new, something that had never been there before: love. It was a strange feeling for him, the idea of being loved without conditions. The first time Tim had told him, "You're part of this family, Andy," it had felt like a distant dream, a concept too unreal to believe. But now, with each passing day, it was becoming his new reality. Every morning, Andy woke up to the warmth of the house, the smell of coffee and pancakes drifting from the kitchen. He would sit at the breakfast table, and Tim would ask him how his day was going or what he'd like for breakfast. They would laugh together over simple things, and for the first time, Andy felt like he belonged. He wasn't a burden. He wasn't someone who had to earn the right to be loved. He simply was. At school, things had also changed. Andy wasn't the shy, withdrawn boy he had been when he first arrived. He talked to his classmates now, laughed with them, and even joined in on sports during recess. The kids at school were starting to see him as just another kid, not the troubled one, not the one with the difficult past. They were seeing Andy for who he was now. A smart, kind, funny boy with a love for soccer and a wicked sense of humor. But the most profound change came when Andy began to realize that he didn't just have a new life. He had a family, his family. He had Tim, who showed up every day no matter how tired he was from work, always ready to listen and talk. And he had Cola, who stayed by his side at night, comforting him when the memories of his past tried to creep back in. One afternoon after school, Tim took Andy to the park. It had become their little tradition to walk through the park together, with Cola happily chasing a ball ahead of them. Tim had bought Andy a new soccer ball for his birthday, a small thing, but one that meant so much. As they sat on a bench afterward, Tim turned to Andy. "You know," Tim began, his voice warm, "you're doing really well. I'm proud of you, Andy. You've come so far." Andy looked up at him, his face breaking into a smile. "Thanks, Tim," he said, his voice steady and full of warmth. "I never thought it would be like this. I never thought I could feel like I actually belong somewhere." Tim placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You belong here, Andy. You belong with us, with me and Cola." Andy's eyes filled with emotion, but there was no fear or sadness in them now, only peace, a peace he had never known before. I know," he whispered, feeling the truth of those words settle deep in his chest. "I really do." As they walked back to the car, Andy felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life he had now. The past, with all its pain, was still there in his memories, but it no longer held him captive. It no longer defined him. He had the power to move forward, to build something new, to make his own choices. He had a family. He had Tim and Cola, and for the first time he could truly say that he had a home. Back at the house, as they sat down for dinner, Andy watched Tim and Cola with a sense of contentment. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. And more than that, he was loved, fully and completely. For the first time, he understood what it meant to truly belong. The family he had longed for was right here, in front of him. And he was never going to let it go. Another Christmas came, and with it a new sense of wonder, a sense that Andy had never known before. The snow had begun to fall gently on the town of Silver Springs, blanketing the streets in a soft, pristine layer of white. Inside Tim's house, warmth radiated from every corner. The smell of freshly baked cookies, the sound of laughter, and the soft glow of the Christmas tree made the home feel like a haven, a place of true belonging. It was the first Christmas that Andy had ever really felt what it meant to celebrate the holiday. Not with fear, not with sorrow, but with peace. For so long he had lived in the shadows of his past, but now the present felt like something to cherish. There were no more nights spent in silence, no more tears shed in the dark. Now there were only smiles, gentle conversations, and the comforting presence of Tim and Cola. That evening they gathered around the dinner table, just the three of them. Tim had cooked their favorite meal, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and vegetables, the kind of food that felt like home. The table was set with care, and each plate was filled with more than just food. It was filled with a sense of togetherness that Andy had never truly experienced. Andy glanced around the table, taking in the sight of Tim and Cola, both smiling, both happy in this moment. He realized that this was what he had always wanted, this warmth, this feeling of being safe and loved. It wasn't just about the presents or the tree or the festive lights. It was about the people around him, the ones who made him feel like he belonged, no matter where he had come from. After dinner, they sat by the fireplace, sipping hot cocoa and sharing stories. Cola lay stretched out beside them, his head resting on Tim's feet, a contented sigh escaping the dog's chest as he dozed off. Tim chuckled softly and scratched Cola behind the ears, glancing at Andy. "Are you feeling okay?" Tim asked, his voice gentle but full of concern. "You've come a long way, Andy. I'm proud of you." Andy looked at Tim, the words filling him with warmth. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider. For the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. "I feel good," Andy said quietly, his voice full of emotion, "like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be, like I finally have a family." Tim's heart swelled with pride as he smiled at the boy. "You do, Andy. You've always had one, even if you didn't know it. And you'll always have a place here, with me and Cola." Andy's eyes filled with unshed tears as he nodded. He had never imagined this day would come, the day when he would truly feel at home, truly feel loved and safe. The moment hung in the air like a quiet promise. It wasn't just about the presents or the holiday cheer. It was about the connection between them, the unspoken bond that had grown stronger with each passing day. Andy had found his family not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the commitment to protect and care for one another. As the night wore on, they exchanged more gifts, shared more laughter, and found comfort in the quiet togetherness of the evening. Andy's heart was full, his mind at peace. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of what the future might bring. He knew that no matter what, he had people who cared about him, people who would never leave him, who would protect him and love him unconditionally. And as they sat there, the fire crackling in the background, Andy knew that this Christmas, this moment wasn't just about the holiday. It was a symbol of the journey they had all taken together. A journey of healing, of trust, and of love. It was the start of a new chapter, one that Andy would face with courage, with hope, and with a family that was always by his side. As the days after Christmas passed, the promise of a better life continued to settle into Andy's heart. He had come a long way from the frightened, withdrawn boy who had first arrived at Tim's house. He wasn't perfect. No one was. But the small steps he had taken toward healing felt monumental. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about living. For the first time in his life, Andy wasn't defined by his past. He wasn't the boy who had been abandoned, the boy who had been left in the cold. No. He was Andy Carter now, part of a family surrounded by love, by people who chose to care for him, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. And that was the most freeing feeling he had ever known. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Cola lying at their feet, Tim looked at Andy, a soft smile on his face. He had watched the boy grow more confident each day, more at ease with the world around him. But tonight, there was something different in Andy's eyes, something that told Tim that the boy had made a choice. He had decided to move forward, to leave the past behind. "Andy," Tim said, his voice calm but filled with pride, "I've seen the way you've been changing. You're becoming someone stronger, someone I'm proud to know. And I can tell you're starting to believe in yourself, in your future. I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'm here for you. Cola's here for you." Andy looked at Tim, his eyes reflecting a quiet strength, a strength that had been born from the love and protection he had found in this home. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," Andy said, his voice steady. "I don't want to be that kid who's always running from everything. I'm done with that. I'm ready to move forward, to be who I really am." Tim's heart swelled with pride, his chest tight with emotion. He had seen this moment coming, had hoped for it, but hearing Andy speak those words was something different. It wasn't just a declaration, it was a transformation. The boy who had feared rejection, the boy who had been unsure of his place in the world, was now standing tall, ready to take control of his future. "That's the spirit, Andy," Tim said softly. "You've come so far, and I know you're going to continue to grow, to become everything you want to be. You're not alone in this journey. We're in this together." Cola lifted his head and looked at Andy, his eyes soft and trusting. It was as if the dog understood that Andy was ready for this next step. Without a word, Cola padded over to Andy and rested his head in the boy's lap. Andy smiled and gently scratched behind Cola's ears, the dog's warmth grounding him. For the first time, Andy truly felt at peace. He wasn't haunted by the past anymore. The shadows that had once loomed over him had started to fade, replaced by the light of new possibilities, new choices. He had a family now. He had Tim, and he had Cola. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a person with a future, with a home. Tim watched as Andy, with Cola by his side, leaned back in the chair, his eyes soft and content. It was clear that Andy had made the decision to embrace his future, to step forward with courage, no longer looking over his shoulder. He was ready to live. He was ready to be happy. And Tim knew that no matter what challenges came their way, they would face them together. This was a new chapter in Andy's life, one that was filled with hope, love, and the certainty of belonging. The days continued to pass in a quiet, comfortable rhythm. As winter faded into spring, the house felt more and more like home. Andy was growing in ways Tim could have only hoped for when he first brought the boy into his life. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living, thriving even, surrounded by a love that had been carefully nurtured over time. Tim watched Andy from the doorway of the living room one evening, the soft glow of the setting sun casting long shadows on the walls. The boy was curled up on the couch with Cola beside him, the dog's head resting on Andy's lap as the boy absent-mindedly scratched behind Cola's ears. They were peaceful, content, a picture of the family they had become. Tim smiled to himself. This was it. This was what he had always wanted. This sense of belonging, of togetherness. It wasn't the family he had been born into, but it was the family he had chosen, a family built not on blood, but on love, trust, and protection. A family forged through choices, through shared experiences, through the quiet acts of kindness that had slowly healed Andy's heart. "Hey, Tim," Andy said softly, looking up at him. There was no hesitation in his voice anymore, no fear of being misunderstood or rejected. "Can we go to the park tomorrow? I want to throw the ball with Cola again." Tim's heart swelled at the request. It was simple, but it was everything. Andy had come so far. He was no longer the boy who doubted his worth, who feared being left behind. He was a boy who asked for things now, who wanted to spend time with the people who loved him. "You got it, buddy," Tim replied, his voice full of warmth. "We'll go. Cola will be happy to play with you." "Yes." Andy smiled, a genuine wide smile that lit up his face. Tim could see it. He could see the boy he had become. Strong, hopeful, happy. As the weeks went by, the bond between the three of them, Tim, Andy, and Cola, only grew stronger. They were a team now, an inseparable unit. They were a family, in every sense of the word. They had built something together, something real, and every day they faced the world as a family should, together. Whether it was tackling the small challenges of everyday life or simply sharing quiet moments of laughter, they were in it together. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, just the three of them, Tim looked across the table at Andy. The boy's face was illuminated by the soft light of the dining room lamp, his eyes bright, his smile wide. There was no trace of the fear that once haunted him, no sign of the boy who had spent so many years in the darkness. "You okay?" Tim asked, his voice gentle. Andy looked up at him, his eyes filled with a quiet contentment. "Yeah, I'm good. I think I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." Tim's heart swelled with pride, and he reached across the table to ruffle Andy's hair. "I'm glad you're here, Andy. We've got a good thing going, don't we?" Andy's smile softened, and he nodded. "Yeah, we do. It's perfect." As they finished dinner, the warmth of the moment wrapped around them like a soft blanket. There were no more tears, no more doubts. Andy had found his place in the world, and Tim had found the family he had always dreamed of. Cola, ever the loyal companion, sat beside them, his tail thumping lightly against the floor. It wasn't just a dog. It wasn't just a pet. Cola was part of the family. He always had been. Tim looked at Andy, then at Cola, his heart full. This wasn't the life he had planned for, but it was the life he had made. A life of love, protection, and choice. A life of family. As they cleared the table and began to settle in for the evening, Tim realized something. Family wasn't about blood. It was about love. It was about the people who chose to stand by you through everything, no matter the cost. It was about the bond that held you together stronger than anything else. And as Andy sat down next to Cola, the dog's head resting on his lap once again, Tim felt a deep sense of peace. They had made it. They had created something beautiful, something real. This was family. This was home. In the quiet moments of life, it is often the unconditional love of an animal that teaches us the most about loyalty, sacrifice, and true companionship. German shepherds, like Cola, are not just dogs. They are guardians, friends, and silent heroes. Their bond with us is built on trust, an unwavering commitment to protect, and an innate understanding that love doesn't need words. For Andy, Cola was more than a pet. He was a constant presence that reminded him he was never alone. Through every challenge, Cola stood by his side, offering comfort and reassurance. With each wag of his tail, Cola showed Andy that love is pure and unconditional, no matter what the past holds. The beauty of a dog's loyalty lies in its simplicity. They do not ask for much, but they give everything. Their love is a quiet force that can heal the deepest wounds, and their loyalty is a reminder that we are worthy of being loved, just as we are. In a world that can feel uncertain, the bond between a dog and its owner is a beautiful reminder that love, in its truest form, requires no conditions, only the willingness to care, to protect, and to stand by each other no matter what. The journey with Cola, with Tim, and with a new family wasn't just about finding shelter. It was about discovering a love that was there all along, waiting to be felt.